My God, why hast thou forsaken me? A phrase uttered both in the Psalms and by Jesus himself at Gethsemane. A phrase that atheist and believer alike relate to on an existential level. It intertwines the poetics of the Old Testament with the guttural pleas of Christ during his persecution. Its pain and beauty beautifully joined together in predestined symphony. I don't think it is too far-fetched to suggest that perhaps these very same words have been spoken or thought of by a good portion of this video's audience, perhaps even by you. It is a part of the human condition to assign blame and search for a culprit to life's woes. And who better fits this mantle of responsibility than the orchestrator of life itself? It is extremely difficult to rectify God's omnibenevolence, being all good, with his omnipotence, of being all-powerful. For how could one with the ability to solve it sit idle and merely allow suffering to continue? This is the problem of evil and suffering, and it is a theological conundrum with its own litany of videos and explanations. But there's a substrata of this famous problem that I wish to delve a little deeper into today. The issue of the non-resistant non-believer. Now, what do those words actually mean? Well, we can broadly sort atheists into categories of tolerance and openness to God. One of these categories is often what the religious zeitgeist immediately thinks of when atheism comes to mind. The Hitchens types, who view the concept of a deity to be insulting to man's humanist rationality. The atheist who looks at God as merely a celestial dictator and nothing more. That is resistant non-belief, a mind that is not open to the idea that a deity's existence is even remotely possible. Another example of resistant non-belief is Richard Dawkins' famous position on divine witness, stating that if God were to appear before him, he would faster believe it to be a hallucination of the mind rather than anything supernatural. However, it's important to ask ourselves and consider, are all atheists like this? Are we all resistant to the prospect of God's existence? Well, of course not. The militancy of Hitchens and Dawkins is a fervour that not all are lucky enough to possess. The certainty of resigning oneself to God's complete inexistence is a nirvanic clarity that one should be grateful for. The rest of us atheists or agnostics find ourselves in the other category, in which throughout our lives we have been non-resistant to God. We've been to church, sang the hymns, dwelled over the Gospels, perhaps even taken the sacraments of Christianity, all in the efforts of trying to catch a glimpse of divine love. And we're met with nothing. Radio silence. We've extended our arms, searching for an embrace, only to be left hanging in non-theistic dejection. The non-resistant non-believer is an individual who craves the love of God, but unfortunately isn't graced with belief. They remain simply unconvinced. The reason I mentioned the problem of evil and suffering to begin with is because under the triomni God of all-powerful, all-knowing and all-good, how could he allow such willing supplicants to languish without his grace? How can the existence of non-resistant non-belief be rectified with an all-powerful and all-benevolent God? If you can tell already, I myself fall into this category of non-resistant non-belief. I plan on studying theology at university. I attend religious ceremonies, listen to the religious music, purvey the art. I've read C.S. Lewis, Aquinas, Augustine. I've listened to religious friends talk about the contingency and fine-tuning arguments at length. I've tried, earnestly, and I think that's a lot to ask of any Christian to pursue their faith to this degree. It should not be this hard to have a relationship with God, and yet there are countless like me who are trying even harder. One is inclined to pity the non-resistant non-believer for their fruitless endeavours, an earnest pursuit of meaning met with absence instead of benevolence. Those that seek the moral life of theism with its ensuing structure and clarity, with an open heart that yearns for the divine but yet remains unanswered. However, empathy and compassion is not always the approach taken. For instance, the 18th century theologian Jonathan Edwards doubts how earnest the non-resistant non-believers truly are, saying and writing that they possess a dreadful stupidity of mind, occasioning a sottish insensibility of their truth and importance. What provoked me to make this short video essay on this argument was Alex O'Connor's podcast interview with Joe Weller, which was truly a crossover I never thought I would see, in which the concept of surrendering to God was put forth as an explanation as to how the non-resistant non-believer, in this case Alex, can exist. I highly recommend watching the entire podcast episode. It's a masterclass in explaining difficult to grasp material in an extremely digestible way. Weller echoes Jonathan Edwards' skepticism as to the authenticity of the pursuit, citing that it is one's masculine ego that gets in the way of Christianity's requirements for humility. And this is an interesting, almost postmodern psychological explanation. However, the issue arises that with this argument is that it's incredibly uncharitable to just how difficult unrequited belief can be. The pain expressed by the passage I read at the beginning, my God, why hast thou forsaken me, is a complete surrender to the power of a deity. The line acknowledges the sheer majesty of the Christian tradition in its universe-spanning totality, with the ego taking a backseat through the acknowledgement of who is truly in control. Therefore, it is not God's omnipotence on trial, but his omnibenevolence. Agnostics like myself and Alex recognize the possibility of an all-powerful first mover. However, Weller fails to grasp just how difficult it is to wrestle with non-belief, with a supposedly benevolent creator that is just silent. Throughout the episode, Weller speaks of his own transformative religious experiences, and honestly, all I can feel is envy, a jealousy born out of a craving for certainty. Religious experience is an incredibly powerful tool for individual evangelization. It is very rare that someone possesses an undying faith that is born out of premise 1, deduction 2. It's far more likely to take the form of emotion or narrative. However, these narratives lose their luster when transferred to others. It is impossible with just words to impart upon others the majesty of divine experience. So when someone who's lucky enough to have experienced and have it bestowed upon them advises to just surrender to God, it appears out of touch to the struggle that is non-resistant non-belief. Look at it this way. It is akin to someone who winning an obscene amount of money in the lottery, turning to their peers who are struggling to make ends meet and saying, just work that little bit harder. Like, really just try to make money. It's incredibly out of touch. Therefore, the plight of the non-resistant non-believer remains and acts as not only an argument for the triomni God's non-existence, but as another tragic facet of the human condition's cruel pursuit of meaning. I'd like to thank you all for listening to this short video essay. This is my first ever video, so I hope it isn't too horrible. And the episode of Joe Weller's podcast that featured Alex O'Connor will be linked in the description. And if you're a fan of philosophy and theology, definitely give it a watch. Thank you all very much.